about me, I work for a company called Integrated Risk Solutions. It's an insurance broker, but I also do DOT consulting. So now tomorrow there's an ELD mandate on the schedule. I'm doing the hour-and-a-half presentation on the ELD mandate. I'll give you a little background on me. So I used to be a state patrol inspector. I worked the weigh stations and pulled people over in the United States of America with a truck. So if anybody in this room has any trucks, have any assets that you're running around delivering freight, ice cream, etc., you're potentially subject to the ELD mandate. We're going to cover that in depth tomorrow for an hour and a half. But if you have specific questions, come see me tonight. So now, I was a state patrol inspector for 12 years. I was an investigator with the federal government. So if you have a US DOT number on your truck, I regulated that for about 8 years. So 12 years inspector, 8 years regulator. Then I was a hazmat specialist with the FAA. So I've been enforcing regulations for the better part of 23, 25 years. I left the federal government, the state government, and I became an insurance agent, which has got me involved with FSMA because a lot of our customers are subject to this. Whether you be a reefer customer or a regular bulk produce customer, it doesn't matter. So we're going to cover this. And then tomorrow with the ELDs, I'll give my background a little bit more about where that comes from, but let's just get started now. So FSMA, what do you need to know? FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, who is subject to this rule? You've got right here, shippers, receivers, loaders, and carriers. Shippers are those people that manufacture the goods, the people that originate the product. Pretty simple. Receivers are the ones that receive the goods. Receivers are only subject to the Modernization Act, the people that receive it, if they in turn get into transportation. So if you're a manufacturer of, say, ice cream, and you bring it to a distribution center who is the receiver, that receiver now becomes the quote-unquote shipper, is now subject to this rule because they received it from the shipper, and now they're going to hire a trucking company to pick it up, or they're going to use their own trucks. Fair enough? So that's when receivers are liable. Now, receivers aren't liable to the Food Safety Modernization Act if they receive the goods and they just use them on site, like a restaurant, etc. Loaders. Now, let's say that you are a distribution center and you have trucks that you distribute freight. Anybody who is loading that, like a forklift operator, anybody physically loading it is 100% responsible under the Food Safety Act. And carriers. Carriers are trucking companies. You can be a for-hire carrier or a private carrier. If you're a for-hire carrier, you're hiring someone to haul the ice cream. If you're a private carrier, you're the distribution network, and you have a fleet of private vehicles. In both cases, you are the carrier. Now, in one case, you're the receiver and the carrier. Carriers engaged in transportation operations. So those are the people subject to this. We'll get into more detail. So carrier means the person who physically moves the freight. Doesn't get into for-hire or private. Then you have transportation operations. Transportation operations means all activities where food is being moved that is subject to the rule. Shipper includes brokers. That's interesting. Does anybody use brokers at all? Right? A little bit? So let's say that you're a shipper of goods and you hire a broker, and the broker takes those goods and hires a carrier. Let's say the shipper says, you broker, you need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G under contract. And then the broker now takes that responsibility and assumes it because it was pushed onto them by the shipper. Now, if the broker doesn't turn around and push that responsibility onto the trucking company, then the broker's responsible. So some brokers are freaking out, like the Landstars and the C.H. Robinsons of the country. They're like, hey, wait a minute. If we sign a contract with a shipper, we need to push a lot of those responsibilities onto the carrier. So you see how everyone doesn't want to take responsibility under this act? What they kind of want to do is sign a bunch of contracts making everybody else responsible. Now, you can't get out of it 100%, but that's what's happening. So what's a non-covered business? A non-covered business is anybody with under $500,000 in annual receipts over a 3-year cycle. Be careful. Let's say you are a manufacturer of ice cream, you're a shipper, and you're going to hire a trucking company, a motor carrier, that has under $500,000 in receipts. You cannot push the responsibilities other than what you can't push the responsibilities under this act to a motor carrier that's under $500,000 in annual revenues. You can do it via contract where you actually are saying from a liability standpoint, from a civil action standpoint, from a contractual liability, you can push it onto them. But if the federal government, a FDA investigator, comes in and says, I want to make sure that this was compliant and this food was unsafe. And you say, well, I pushed that specific responsibility onto the trucking company. And then they say, well, the trucking company's only got $300,000 in revenue. You can't do that. So be careful who you hire and who you're pushing the responsibility onto. So that's who is covered by the rule. Now we have small business and other businesses. Let's focus on small business. If you if you are a shipper or receiver that has fewer than 500 persons, you're a small business. If you're a trucking company with less than $27.5 million in revenue, you're a small business. Everyone else is a large business. Now, this rule was published in April of 2016. We got the date? Any large business, which is not the small here, what happened there? Takes forever. All right, so small businesses have 2 years from April of 16. So they have till April 2018 if you're a small business to comply. The other entities, which would be anybody with more than 500 people, and any trucking company with more than $27.5 million in revenue, they had to comply last April, basically, in the rule. So now, some shippers have assigned responsibility through contract already under FSMA to motor carriers. What's interesting is if you assign that responsibility prior on a small business, if you assign the responsibility on a small business already, they're not subject to the rule until April, so you're still responsible. You think you've pushed the responsibilities of FSMA onto someone that's a small business, but you haven't, because they're not legally responsible for this until this April. Fair enough? So that kind of breaks down who's covered based on the business size. Now there's some exceptions to it. If you transship through the United States to another country, if some freight's going from Mexico all the way to Canada, transshipping through, that motor carrier, the shipper, nobody's responsible under FSMA because it was transshipped through. If it's not consumed or distributed in the United States, then you're exempt, and anything regulated exclusively by the USDA, something that doesn't fall under FDA. So what requirements? Carrier responsibilities when there's a written contract with the shipper. Carriers have 3 things they need to be concerned with. Trucking companies is what I'm saying. Anybody who moves the freight. They have 3 things to be concerned of. Number 1, if you do bulk food that's not in a packaged, like produce, like bulk produce, you have to have written procedures and training to make sure that you clean out the trailer and you keep track of what was in there before. If you don't do that as a carrier, even without a contract, you're in trouble. The next one would be temperature control. You have to make sure that you can indicate to the receiver, this is the temperature that it was, and you have to prove to the investigator that I maintain this temperature throughout. Does that make sense? So whatever means you have to prove to a federal investigator that I maintain the temperature throughout, and this was the temperature when I came, that's what you're required to do. Now, if you do it through temperature monitoring systems and GPS and all that, it's easier to prove to the investigator. If you're using some old traditional way, which I'm not familiar with ice cream enough to know, just beware. Because if you're not doing something that's real technical and you can't prove it to them, you could be liable. So, other than, all right, so it's that, and then cleaning out the trailer or the truck. Let's say you have a truck and you deliver some freight. You have to have procedures on how to sweep and clean out the truck and trailer, and you have to train your people on that. So there's 3 things carriers have to do, period. Sweep your trailer, clean it, have written procedures for that, bulk shipments, and temperature control. Everything else that could adulterate food is the shipper responsibility. But many shippers are saying via contract, I'm not taking responsibility for this and this and this and this. One could be like rodent manifestation, right? I'm responsible to make sure that there's no rodents and there's no ants in the truck or trailer. I can push that responsibility onto the motor carrier throughout the transportation. Fair enough? So there are many written contracts that are now happening where shippers and brokers are pushing the responsibility onto the carriers. And this is why, because you're not responsible unless they do it. Now here's a big one. You must prevent food from becoming unsafe. Unsafe. Many shippers in the country are seeing something they don't like, something that isn't acceptable to them, and they're saying, FSMA, and they're rejecting freight. And they're doing it because they don't, from a common sense standpoint, think it's reasonable for whatever you did. However, it might not be unsafe, fair enough? It has to be deemed unsafe. If it's not deemed unsafe, they can't reject it, but there's a couple steps that you need to go into. But ultimately, the goal of this is to prevent food from becoming unsafe. So now, FSMA is to have a food safety effect. It has nothing to do with insurance and claims. You see what I'm saying? So the goal of FSMA is to make sure food is safe for human consumption, period. And the FDA wrote this for that exact reason. But claims handling and shippers rejecting loads, picture this. You have a shipper, and he gives freight to a motor carrier and pushes responsibility onto the motor carrier via contract. The motor carrier delivers it to a receiver, and the receiver says, I don't like what I see there. I'm not going to accept that freight. Now the motor carrier is in possession of it. The shipper says, hey, they're not accepting it because of something I said was your fault. So now the motor carrier is sitting here with all this freight. The shipper says it's theirs. The receiver says it's theirs. Now the motor carrier has to pay for it. Can he file an insurance claim? Maybe or maybe not, which we're going to get into in a minute. He can't file an insurance claim, but should the receiver have been able to say no? Here's a good example that I lived through. There was, and it's not ice cream, but I'll tell you, they had a trucking company with meat in the front of the trailer. Cancel that. Feta cheese in the front of the trailer, meat in the back of the trailer. They took the meat and delivered it. There was a little spot of blood in the back of the trailer. All of the feta cheese was packaged. When they got to the facility, there was a little blood in the back of the trailer. The receiver rejected it because there was a little bit of blood in the back of the trailer, and they said that that was adulterated. Now, when you get to that, a receiver could say it's adulterated, but you as a motor carrier can say, I want an independent determination of whether this was deemed adulterated under this act. If a third-party entity says, no, I get what you're saying about the blood, but it did not adulterate the food. It was not unsafe for human consumption. Then the receiver can't reject. They don't have a right to reject just because of their own opinion. You have to determine that. Now, where's a motor carrier or a shipper in trouble? They want to appease the receiver because it's their customer. If you start bucking the system there, a lot of the receivers will be like, I'll go find my business somewhere else. So you see how there's this balancing act going on. But it is not a claim situation. It's food safety. Now, there's a comment in the federal regulation, and here's what it says. Under CARMAC, in order to have a claim for cargo, which would be ice cream out of temperature, right? In order to have a claim for that, you have to have actually lost cargo, it got stolen, or it has to be physically damaged. If a receiver, like with the feta cheese, was that physically damaged? No, they just didn't like it. And an independent entity didn't even deem it adulterated under this act. But even if it was adulterated, is that physical damage just because it was deemed adulterated? So these are all the things that you got to work through. But you have insurance coverage if it's actually lost or there's physical damage. So many of your insurance carriers will not cover FSMA adulterated food because they will not take the leap between adulterated and physical damage. Do we get it? So an inconsequential failure for carrier to meet the shipper's temperature control system. So this is in the comment. Let's say a shipper says, if you're going to transport my ice cream, right, you need to have it at this temperature, and it has to be this, has to be this, has to be this. And it gets to the receiver, and the receiver says, you didn't follow the shipper's manufacturer recommendations. Well, let's say the shipper is overboard. Let's say they require more than is necessary to be safe. The receiver rejects it based on what the shipper said. This comment right there in the middle says that just because you didn't follow what the shipper said does not mean it's adulterated. Does not mean it's unsafe. An independent entity, either the FDA themselves or a third-party person, can come in and make that determination. A lot of receivers are saying, you know what, you didn't follow what the shipper said, so I'm rejecting it. You have protections as a carrier in that realm. You get what I'm saying? So, and therefore, we do not anticipate that this rule will have a significant impact on cargo claims. But it somewhat has because these trucking companies are afraid to push the envelope with the shippers. So now, travelers. Who's ever heard of travelers? Travelers insurance? I'd say this thing's been in it's been rearing its head for, I don't know, maybe 2 years now, 2.5 years. Travelers just in the last 2 months made this determination with their cargo policy. They're not the only one that's done it, but this is what they've said. There's this Food Cosmetic Act, which is older than FSMA. This term deemed adulterated was actually defined in the Cosmetic Act, and it says, if the ice cream may have been adulterated, it's deemed adulterated. I'll say it again. May have been adulterated, it's deemed adulterated. That's what that third-party entity has to determine. Well, who thinks may have been adulterated, which is deemed adulterated, is physical damage? Who feels that's the case? Probably not, right? So most insurance companies are like, I'm not covering you. But Travelers said, coverage for cargo damaged or adulterated under FSMA or FDA regulation is included in our form. Coverage for cargo deemed damaged or adulterated under FSMA is not sublimited, meaning they don't reduce the amount of coverage, right? No time reporting, and if you like waive salvage abilities, you know how some ice cream people will say, listen, I don't want you to salvage my ice cream. If you waive that ability, it doesn't reduce the coverage that you have. So now, are they the only ones? No. But if you're a trucking company right now, or cancel, if you have a fleet of vehicles, or you hire a trucking company, or in any aspect having a cargo claim, there's actually coverage out there for you, right, through Travelers. And there's not many that are doing it. So now, adulterated food, watch out. Non-compliance with the practices. Not necessarily the shipper practices, but something that is a third-party entity deems is unsafe for transportation or in the logistics chain. If that happens, that's where adulterated comes into play. So, is there a right to reject? We're going to go back to what I said before. We kind of discussed it. Does a receiver have a right to reject just because they feel like it? The answer is no. They have to prove it is adulterated. You can't just reject it because there's a small piece of blood sitting in the end of the trailer if the feta cheese never made it past that. You see what I'm saying? The driver could wipe that up, and then it's cleaned up, and then you move the feta cheese off that's packaged. That's not adulterated. But I had a customer where they rejected the feta cheese. What did my customer do? They paid for it out of pocket because it was their best customer and they didn't want to rock the boat with their customer. You see how bad of a situation that can be? But you need to know what your rights are, your legal rights under FSMA. And just because someone says, we have options. Now, if you're a shipper of goods and you have a good relationship with your trucking company and your receiver, your customer says this, work as a team. Everybody work united to try to work this out through the training provided here, right? So when it comes to rejected food, there's a really good memo here where there's this comment right here in this response. So if you click on this little PDF, you can actually read this comment 15 in the response. And what does it say? Shippers, loaders, carriers, receivers, it precludes the sale or distribution of any food where there's an indication of failure or temperature control or any other condition that may render the food unsafe, unless a determination is made by a qualified individual that the deviation or other condition did not render the food unsafe. So this is what you have in your pocket if you want to make sure that someone at the other end is claiming that this stuff is unsafe. Third-party qualified inspector. Fair enough? All right, so, all right, what requirements apply to transportation operations? A carrier, which is the trucking company, the person moving the freight. If requested by a receiver, they have to provide temperature. This is the section. Now, when you go into the Food Safety Act, it's 1.908. It says that a carrier, whoever has the truck and has the ice cream in the truck, when they get to a receiver, and the receiver says, show me the current temperature, you're required to show it to him. Then he says, show me that this has maintained temperature from pickup till now. There's many ways to do this. This is not about telling you what way you should do, but you have to demonstrate that to a human being who's an investigator with the federal government. If you are not confident in your practices, then you need to reconsider evaluating those to make sure that you can provide that temperature proof throughout. Because it says you have to demonstrate that it has maintained temperature conditions throughout the transportation operation. You guys have any questions so far? Because we're just kind of flowing through this. I'm data dumping to you guys. Go ahead.
Just one thing that's important is when John talks about the shipper, for the most part, that's us. It's not a third-party transportation company.
You're right.
For the most part, we're doing our own deliveries, and we're responsible when we make that delivery to the customer. When he says the receiver, that's our customer, and they are getting more and more sophisticated in understanding the laws. So they can ask to, and they have for us, to demonstrate that we're in compliance with FSMA and that we have the history of the temperature of the product from when it left our warehouse until it got to their door. And that's why this is such a huge deal in our industry right now, because it's new regulations that directly impact us. And you,
And to reiterate what he's saying, if you are manufacturing the ice cream and you have a fleet of private vehicles, when you put it in a truck, that's the carrier. You're the carrier.
so it's the manufacturer that brings the product to us, has to comply with these rules, as well as we who are delivering it to the end user.
Correct. Even if you use your own trucks, because you are the carrier if you use your own trucks.
Using your own trucks in the delivery process.
100%.
Most of your audience here, they are distributors. So they are receiver and the shipper at the same time.
Good.
So just making sure that
That we understand that, yep. So when I say trucking company, I mean you. It's just you're a private trucking company because you're hauling freight in your truck. Just because you arrange the freight for yourself doesn't change the fact. But now, I'll tell you, they will not call you the receiver under FSMA. They're going to call you the carrier when you're in a truck. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Does the liability end once you've passed the product? So if you have it in your truck, you're responsible, you drop it off at your customers, they sign for the goods, they now have it, your liability ends?
The shipper is responsible, first and foremost. He's responsible the whole way through unless he pushes responsibilities onto someone else. Once it's received by you, then you become the shipper.
And you give up that liability?
You give up the liability from the original manufacturer. Once the manufacturer gets it to your distribution point and that you receive it, and now you're going to reload it onto trucks, you become that quote-unquote shipper, but they still call you a receiver that's doing transportation.
When you drop it at your customers?
Once you drop it at the customer, then it's on them. And if they redistribute it in a truck, then they become the receiver, just like you were when you were a distributor.
But once it's in their warehouse, it's their responsibility.
Right. As soon
Once
as they sign for it.
Correct. 100% yes.
What about pickups? You have a customer that picks up.
A company that picks up from you?
A customer that picks up.
So you are a receiver, you're a distribution center because you got it from the manufacturer. Now a customer comes and picks it up. You're loading it onto their truck, so you're a loader, you're subject. You're a receiver that is offering it to a motor carrier. So you should have in your contracts pushing responsibility onto the customers that pick it up because they are the carrier then. They're a private carrier picking up the freight to bring it to their facility. You see what I'm getting at?
Well, in our case, what I think Nick's referring to is a direct reseller who's going to sell the product out of their ice cream shop, for example. So they're going to pick up and buy the ice cream at his depot. So once he sells it to them, the responsibility becomes
Theirs. They're not delivering it to someone else. They're the warehouse, so they're the receiver. So in that case, if you give ice cream to an ice cream truck, then that ice cream truck is the receiver and it's on him to make sure that it maintains temperatures. Go ahead.
On the third-party verification, is there, if you go to a lawyer, there's organizations that verify he's a lawyer. Where do you get these third-party, is there an association or something?
Nope. And here's the dumb part. They have not put any qualification requirements out for these qualified inspectors at all. And the reason they did it is because ice cream is ice cream, beef is beef, produce is produce, and what would make one unsafe for human consumption could be completely different than what makes the other thing unsafe. So they have not put guidance out or training requirements or anybody for the qualified inspector. Go ahead.
So therefore, can the receiver become the third party?
All right, that is a question that I would have to check in the frequently asked questions if they allow you to become the third party if you are defined as a receiver. I would guesstimate no. I think it probably says independent, but I'll have to check that. I'm not going to put words in my mouth. Go ahead.
So with the statement as far as coming into the depot, does it, so we don't have like official contracts for our vendors that come in and purchase. Can you just have a statement that's like in your depot, or does it need to be on the invoice?
It has to be a written agreement. So now brokers, like freight brokers in the U.S., are today with this act, and it's similar to you but not completely. Before they give freight to anybody with a truck, they do like a rate confirmation sheet and they do like a purchase, like a rate agreement, and in their rate confirmation sheet they put FSMA language of what responsibilities they want on them. Now in your case, where you just said it's an ice cream truck, that's different. You're giving it to them, they're the receiver, it's done. It's the same as you giving it to a restaurant. Now, he's a receiver that has transportation operations. So your ice cream guy has to prove that. And if you want to go crazy, who is the receiver of the ice cream guy? I guess I don't think it would go that far. The consumer, right? So, but ultimately, when it comes to this, independent, we had answered that question, so we're good there.
To Bailey's point, when you're selling it to an ice cream truck, once you deliver it to them at their dock, you're good.
You're done.
They come in and pick up,
If they're coming and picking up and taking it someplace else or to sell it themselves.
so we need no statement.
If they're selling it themselves, no.
But if you give ice cream to a truck and he brings it to another distribution center or some other receiver that's going to do something with it, if that ever happens, then yes, you're responsible until it finishes its transportation to that end place, which would be whatever it is. So
That means the sub-distributor. If a sub-distributor comes and picks it up from you, you have to put it on your invoice or something.
Correct.
That this language, and once they sign it, then you pass on the
But
responsibility.
if you physically put the product in your truck and deliver it to a sub-distributor, that's its final destination
Right.
for me, so then I no longer.
yes, but you're responsible while it's in your truck.
Yes.
And then that last place can question you about your temperature. Now, if you had a guy pick it up instead of an ice cream truck, it was a guy that was bringing it to a restaurant.
That's what I meant.
If a guy's bringing it to a restaurant, well, then it's in transportation until it gets to the restaurant. And you'd want to push responsibilities onto the guy driving it to his restaurant.
To be more specific, if you have a pickup for a sub-distributor, as Has was saying, that keeps it on his own truck, but delivers it to other,
To the end consumer. It would be the same as a restaurant giving it to someone walking through the door. An ice cream truck giving it to someone is the same as going to a...
distributor is going to be selling it to a store. The store is going to be selling it to the final.
So if you're selling it to a store, well, then the store is the receiver of it. It's not a consumer.
No, what he's talking about,
Yeah.
the sub-distributor picks up from him, and he goes and starts selling to restaurants. You have to pass on responsibility
Correct.
to him on your invoice.
Because the restaurants are the
In
receiver.
the case of ice cream truck, you don't have the responsibility.
That's different because the ice cream truck is the receiver. He's the restaurant.
In the case of the sub-distributor, you have the responsibility.
Yes.
Unless you have a contract.
You have to push the responsibility onto a sub-distributor because he's not the final destination of the food product. With an ice cream truck, just thinking that through, an ice cream truck is a restaurant.
Regardless of him never taking the product outside his truck before he did it, right?
Because the consumer is buying it from him, the consumer is buying it from a restaurant. FSMA does not regulate food preparation within a restaurant. Fair enough? But if it's going from you in a truck to someone else who is going to be the receiver in commerce, well, then that middle truck is a trucking company. And if it isn't your truck, you just hired a for-hire trucking company to pick up freight and go there. Unless that person is a distributor, then they're a private entity, but you're still a
It
carrier.
doesn't matter whether he's the guy that picks up the product, whether he keeps it there as a storage and also a delivery vehicle.
Yes,
It doesn't
but
matter.
the responsibility is his.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, so it's the same responsibility.
So you have to understand where that line in the sand is.
Right.
So what makes
And-
this very relevant to our industry is this is all new. This isn't like things that have been on the books and they're just starting to enforce it. They're very aggressively going to be enforcing it over the next few years.
Starting in April.
And even a smaller company, they monitor you through, through all the, licensing and do with your vehicles and everything. And they're going to be watching everybody. And to John's point and to Mr. Norman's point, the regulations are still being developed. So, can anybody be a third party right now? Maybe. But eventually that's going to get fixed. Because it's all still in the development stage. But it affects everybody, just about everybody in our association that's in distribution. Because once you take ownership of that product, you have to be able to, you may have to demonstrate that it's been maintained at the right temperature, that when you put it on your trucks, that you're monitoring that temperature and recording it when you get audited. And as much as we don't want to believe it's going to happen, we already know that it's happening.
So instead of going into hypothetical scenarios at this early game, think of this. Shippers, loaders, receivers, and carriers. That's who's responsible. It defines all of those in FSMA. Then the government will take all the different scenarios and apply it to those 4 people. So if you make it and you bring it into transportation that first time, you're a shipper. Then if it's in transportation, you're a carrier. Then if it goes to someone who receives it, you're the receiver. And if that's the end place where there's no subsequent transportation, then that's the restaurant. But if that person receives it and then there's more transportation, well, then you're a receiver who performs transportation. Now you have more transportation. This goes from the original place until it gets somewhere where there's no more transportation. It's basically to make sure that it's covered from beginning to end. And what they did in the past is they would just respond to complaints. Now they're requiring you to put measures in place and investigating those measures and issuing fines and penalties for not being proactive starting in April. Go ahead.
I see the stamp recently that said that we received the goods but subject to inspection. So therefore, you're still, as a shipper, you're still responsible, and the store has not taken the responsibility of the quality of the product because it's subject to inspection.
But subject to inspection at the receiver. Yes, all of this is subject to inspection at the receiver because if he feels it's unsafe when he receives it, he can reject it.
No, under that line, subject to inspection, the guy can inspect it a week later. We can get the ice cream.
But FSMA won't allow a week later inspection. It's not in the rule. It says once the transportation is terminated at final destination, that's it. They had a chance to reject it at that time. They can't go back 4 months and then say that it was bad later. Go ahead.
Going kind of along those lines, so say I load my truck and go, guys, hour or two to wherever he's going. I don't know, somebody's yelling at the driver, can't hear him, he turns off the reefer. Oh, we want to pull this one out real quick. He pulls out, he pulls back in, the guy goes, oh, the reefer wasn't running, I want to reject it. The guy goes, it was off for 2 minutes, we can turn it on, check the temperature, then there's the dispute.
Yes. So you have to prove that you maintain temperature throughout. If you turn it off for 2 minutes, then that non-certified, qualified inspector would make that determination, or the government themselves.
Where do we get that person?
They don't have a list. They haven't published that. You could go to an expert. One thing you could potentially do is, you guys are experts in the room as to when ice cream becomes unsafe, correct? So think about this. You know who the experts are in the United States as it relates to whether ice cream is unsafe based on temperature maintaining? You. I'm not. But you guys are in this business, so you're all qualified. Go ahead.
And to kind of belabor his point, it's not now you have to go back they make loggers, okay, where you can, for $75, you can get 2 months of 5-minute readings on the temperature of a box. Okay? And you have to be able to go back. Doing it, like turning it on and saying, okay, well, it's at temperature now, means nothing. If he drove for 2 hours to get there, you have to be able to prove
Correct.
2 hours.
Correct.
It was at temperature.
Correct. And I'll tell you, in the rule, if you read the rule, it talks about ambient temperatures on the dock. And I'm not going crazy, ambient temperatures on the dock. So you have a freezer in your facility, then you move it out of the freezer and there's a truck that's pre-cooled, which we didn't get to yet, pre-cooled trailer or truck. What do you do in between your freezer and the pre-cooled trailer? It says do that expeditiously. Do it in a way where it still maintains temperature. You and I know that if you grab ice cream from a freezer and you immediately put it in a pre-cooled truck, directly within a minute or two, it's going to maintain its temperature, right? So now you'd have to prove somehow. You could have cameras in your facility where when you leave the freezer and you have the truck, you can see, look, it left here at this time stamp and it went over here at this time stamp just because it was in the ambient air. Because when you're talking about turning your freezer off, you're just talking about it being in, and that's not even ambient air. That's still a trailer that's frozen that you turned it off for a minute. That's better, correct, than being at the warehouse, potentially, where you're moving it from a freezer to a truck. Now, I challenge you, grab this rule and read through it. This is an exposure training, right? We're trying to make you understand that it's here. But a lot of these specific things, this rule is like 70 pages long and gives anecdotes and examples. Go ahead.
Anywhere do they list out we're only talking about temperature. because that's the biggest thing that will affect our.
Because that's us.
But is there a list of other things, like in Canada, peanuts are a big.
Yes.
You can't put peanuts on the same.
100%. I'm talking about there is the bulk. Remember I told you carriers are responsible for bulk, and you have to have procedures where you keep track of what was in there before you put this in there. So you can't put nuts in there and then put strawberries in there. And if you do, you have to clean the trailer in between because it's a bulk trailer. And if you don't clean it properly, then you could have issues of contamination. So is that in the FSMA rule? Yes. Not really. It just basically broadly says any food for human consumption.
See, these rules are still a work in progress. And it's brand new. Over the next few years, they're refining it. You're still required to be in compliance during the process.
When I get to a piece here, I'll show it to you. There's a link to some training that you can give your drivers. Some of us have drivers, right? There's some training online for free they just put out 2 months ago. Prior to 2 months ago, it wasn't there. To meet the driver training requirements, there's a webinar on the FDA website. You can get a certificate when you're done. When you click on that link that's in this PowerPoint for the training, it brings you to their website. And what they have is frequently asked questions. And in the frequently asked questions, they're updating them continuously right now because of what you said. Go ahead.
Just wanted to let everybody know this presentation and every other presentation during this time is going to be available to you guys through the app. So if some of this information is important, don't worry, you can get the copy of the information.
You must pre-cool, and demonstrate how you pre-cool. And I'm trying to stay on time here too. So now, what requirements do you need for a carrier? A carrier is someone who moves the freight in a vehicle with an engine in it, right? A carrier must develop written procedures regarding the cleaning, sanitizing, and inspecting of vehicles. So all the transportation equipment, which would be bins or boxes, etc., have to be inspected, cleaned, and sanitized. You got to sanitize your trailer and inspect it, and you have to put in writing how you're going to do that. So if anybody here's a receiver that does transportation and has vehicles that you're going to put the ice cream in, you have to have written procedures, and then you have to put them into place and train everybody on how to clean and sanitize equipment and trailers and trucks. Written procedures. So that's one written procedure. The other thing you have to have, and we talked about this earlier, but the carrier must provide training. The training must be provided upon hiring and needed thereafter. So when you hire a guy that's going to drive in one of your trucks on the road, you need driver training, right? But this is the part. A carrier and shipper have agreed in writing. That's the part. A carrier and a shipper sign contracts. Carriers have those three responsibilities I said, but anything that's on a shipper, he can assign that to a carrier, and then the carrier has to have written procedures about that and train their people on those additional responsibilities. This is the training. So you see this link right here? If you go to this link, it brings you to the FSMA website at the FDA. Click on it, the training is right there. But now you can start searching, and it's got frequently asked questions, it has the rule, it has all the different contexts, etc. You must maintain training records. Those training records can be kept off-site, but you have to bring them within 24 hours, right? Data training, type of training, etc. So you have to maintain records 12 months. They can be off-site. Now, the other piece, though, is the procedures, the written procedures for cleaning out your trailer and the written procedures for temperature control. You have to keep those at your facility because the procedures are supposed to be in place and readily accessible for those people that need to put those procedures into place. 24 hours you can do that for. All right, equipment. Your equipment has to be so designed, your equipment, I'm talking about your transportation equipment, whether they're bins, trucks, reefer units, for temperature control or whatever else you do, they have to be so designed, suitable, and adequately cleaned to make it so that product does not become adulterated. Now, in the FSMA Act, which is kind of interesting, I read through it again for you guys because of freezing of the product, it says that you don't have to have a reefer unit. You'd think that a reefer unit would potentially be required, but it's not. You can have like dry ice. If you can maintain the temperature and prove that you had that temperature maintained and show the temperature when it gets delivered, it does not have to be like a refrigeration unit.
There's also
Yeah.
cold plates that a lot of our members use.
Correct. So I don't want you to think that you have to leave and go into the old refrigeration units with this in order to meet the rule. It says clearly in there you do not. So you don't have to change well-established industry procedures on how to keep this food within proper temperature. Go ahead.
But where are the standards? So like we're talking about training and procedures.
Mm-hmm.
My cleaning and defrosting schedule might be very different than his.
Right.
So what makes mine right and his wrong, or vice versa? I mean, how?
For 20 years, I've been a government regulator, right? Not with the FDA, but the DOT and hazmat regulations. I would take this very similar to transporting hazmat in a sense. This is how hazmat works. You train people on general awareness. You make sure they understand as a general rule what you need to do to keep out of trouble and keep the food safe. But now, if I'm hazmat and I'm transporting corrosive liquids in 5-gallon pails inside of a cardboard box, that's one guy. And this guy has a cargo tank. But he doesn't ever transport boxes on pallets. He transports a cargo tank. There are specific differences as to what you need to do to make sure that this cargo tank hazmat is transported safely versus the stuff in the box. So now let's talk about us. We have to do certain things with cleaning and sanitizing and temperature control to make sure that our ice cream is safe for human consumption. Now, feta cheese, they have different cleaning procedures. They have different, because the equipment that you're going to use might be different. They have different cleaning procedures. They have different temperature specifications. So what you need to do as a subject matter expert is develop procedures for cleaning and temperature control that you feel are necessary to keep your product safe. FSMA's not really going to question whether you, a subject matter expert, put the proper procedures in place. Because when I was a government official and I enforced hazmat, I might disagree with your hazmat training because I think it stunk, right? But you did it and you met all the minimum elements. So I couldn't hold you accountable for it. Same thing here. Just don't not put something in place. If I come in as an investigator and say, where's your written procedures for cleaning out your trucks? I don't have any. That's where you're going to get a fine. So you have to start taking these extra steps. Go ahead.
What are the fines like for violations?
It says $50,000 maximum, but the way that they generally do that with the government, because I was at the FAA and all the government agencies are the same, they take into account your size, revenue, ability to pay, and the fine structures are generally based on that. But
Larger companies
pay more, 100% more. I mean, it's just the way it is. I always equate it to trucks. Schneider National gets a fine for no drug testing program, and it might be $2,000 for a small company. Well, what's $2,000 to Schneider? Nothing. So then they get a fine for $80,000. Same offense. But you can't give a trucking company with 2 trucks an $80,000 fine. You put them out of business. Same exact concept that will happen here, 100%. So, but you have to have properly designed, suitable, and accurately cleaned equipment and put procedures in place as associated with that. This talks about what applies to equipment. Temperature control, it has to be designed, maintained, and equipped to provide adequate temperature control to prevent the food from becoming unsafe. Designed, maintained, and equipped. So if you don't have properly designed temperature control systems, they're not maintained, they're not equipped to maintain that temperature, then you could be subject to this because the food could become unsafe. This is some of the equipment. Pallets are part of equipment because it's potentially touching food. Any bins, ladders, etc. Anything that could be exposed to the food. Now, what is adequate temperature control? They define it. In FSMA, they define it, and they say it's the adequate means that which is needed to accomplish the intended purpose in keeping with good public health practices. Wow, right? So when you said, what is the adequate temperature? A shipper might say, I want you to put it at this temperature. But the receiver doesn't, and then it isn't followed. Let's say in the middle it isn't followed. You say you wanted it at this temperature. Receiver says you didn't follow theirs. This is the standard. Adequate. They don't tell you what temperature because they can't because there's so many different foods in the country. So what you need to do is defend yourself. Set your temperatures at levels that you think are reasonable. Put procedures in place so then they maintain. Put procedures in place so you pre-cool. So if you prove that you're pre-cooling, maintaining, and you have the proper temperature set, and during the entire transportation from shipper to final destination, that's maintained, we're all good. But you have to document, prove, and train, and put that into place. Now, I won't say this, but how many people don't have that right now? Where they just kind of go with what they've always done. Well, take a day or two and write it all down on a piece of paper.
Would you be so kind to describe the definition of adulterated product?
I'd have to go into the Cosmetic Act of, I think, 1999, because they're using the definition of adulterated in the Cosmetic Act. By all means, I can pull it up, look it up, and read it to you. I don't have it in the PowerPoint, and I'm not going to paraphrase if I don't have it memorized in my head. But the big piece of it is, if it is deemed adulterated, it's adulterated. Because in the Cosmetic Act, it doesn't use the word adulterated. It used the words, if an independent entity deems it adulterated. Then the FSMA Act said, if it's deemed adulterated under the Cosmetic Act, then it's adulterated. You see how they define that?
Adulterated somehow means
Unsafe for human.
contaminated.
Well, they don't use the word contaminated. They say unsafe for human consumption. If the product is adulterated, where it in turn becomes unsafe for human consumption, that's deemed adulterated. And then they don't use the term deemed adulterated in FSMA. In FSMA, they said, if it's deemed adulterated over here, then we're going to call it adulterated. So see how they're making a bridge between the two regulations? Go ahead. Yeah.
Just one thing. I think it's important for everybody to know, and I think you alluded to it, that as long as you have a written procedure on what you deem to be adequate, safety for the transportation of your food, you have a written document that says, my temperatures are going to be between -10 and -3, based on variations you're going to have when you open the doors and things like that. As long as you have a written procedure, when they come in and do an audit, you'll do well. You have to follow your own procedures. Right now, they don't have a hard procedure on what kind of temperatures we need. You need to have your own definition, your own company policy on what you feel is safe. And you come in and have an audit, or you get called in for a road check, which they're going to be doing road check.
They already started. I'll tell you that. They already started doing mock, non-enforceable inspections of facilities around the country for people that aren't even subject yet to see if they're ready. Go ahead.
Real quick, as a regulator for hazardous, okay? Let's say there was a hazardous association and they drew up some basic regulations for cleaning, all right, or for transporting. As a regulator, would you accept those as part of the guidelines for calling hazards? Now, transfer that to field.
This is a new thing, like he had said. I'm going to go to another aspect of my life, which people with a DOT number will get it. FMCSA is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. If you have trucks and have a DOT number, they regulate you, and that's what we're talking about tomorrow with ELDs. That's where I've spent my whole career. I have not, let's just say this, spent my entire career with the FDA. But I will tell you this, who's ever heard of CVSA, the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance? The Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance has an out-of-service criteria book, and they also have CVSA inspection procedures. CVSA is an independent nonprofit organization that works in conjunction with a federal agency called FMCSA to provide guidance to inspectors nationwide on how to apply the regulations as it relates to out-of-service and proper inspection procedures. Could FDA line themselves with a quote-unquote CVSA entity? Yes. Is that necessary? Well, based on the conversation in this room, I'd say it's absolutely necessary. But the rule's brand new. They will not start with an association to come up with best practices before they even have a rule in place. You know what I'm saying? What's that?
From our side, can our association create some guidelines for cleaning boxes that would be a beginning for a
All right.
start?
What I would say is that would be yes. Because if I was an investigator of 20 plus years in other regulatory bodies and I was provided a document from an association that is absolutely educated in this area, me as an FDA guy would take that information as a baseline for what is best practice. So yes, that would be a great idea. It would be very similar to CVSA. The only difference is it would not be incorporated into the rule, where with CVSA, FMCSA has actually incorporated that guidance that's been developed over 40 years in the rule itself. But yes, absolutely, that would be a great, I'll tell you, pipeline associations do that all the time. Do you want me to cover any more? I mean, $50,000 fine. The Department of Justice talks about civil penalties. Contracts are a big thing. Get yourself some good insurance coverage.
Talk a little bit about tomorrow's.
Qualified individual, I'll cover that. I'm almost done, there's not many. I am an insurance agent. This is an attorney that I work with that I like a lot. Looking over your contracts, find someone like them to look over your contracts that you're going to put in place with all your people. So now, this is me. Tomorrow, I'm talking ELDs. So electronic logging devices. Do you need them? Are you exempt? When do you need them? How do you implement them? What device should you pick? What are the hours of service? What challenges do you have now, and how do we fix some of those challenges? Now, I'm not saying I don't know FSMA. I know FSMA like a 9 out of 10. I know ELDs like 100 out of 10. I was brought here for the ELD presentation tomorrow, but because I was here and I have familiarity with FSMA, they asked me to jump into here. But tomorrow you have all of your ELD questions answered 100% for sure. So thank you for your time. Good? Yep.
Thanks so much.